So now I want everyone to, again, give me a thunderous round of applause for everyone who spoke today. Next up, I'm going to pass it over to Winona and Alex from the University of Michigan, and they're going to introduce our speaker for the night, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Winona, and this is Alex Fitzpatrick, and we're students from GlobeNet at the University of Michigan. We're excited to be here today to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed.
As a physician, epidemiologist, and current executive director of the Detroit Health Department, Dr. El-Sayed's work closely aligns with our vision of what a healthy, thriving Detroit could look like. Our chapter has worked with the Joy Southfield Community Development Corporation in the Cody Rouge neighborhood of Detroit since we were founded. We work with them to serve this community through community building, gardening, health, and education platforms. Through this local partnership, we aim to get students locally while also helping students involved locally while also helping to address Detroit's food desert crisis through community-driven programming.
So together, we're tackling one of Detroit's biggest public health issues and working to build a brighter future for our city.
The work that the amazing staff at Joy Southfield is doing is not easy, but we know that there are so many brilliant people working to address these complex health issues every day. Dr. Abdul El-Sayed recently told the journal MedPage Today, "There are days when I think that there's no way we can get there. But every time I meet people in the community and see the resilience, I see how eager everyone is to be for this to be a great city. And I think about the individuals themselves, the moms, who are working as hard as they can to raise children. I think if they can work that hard in their circumstances, I surely can do the same in mine."
As young people, we are so inspired by the fact that Dr. El-Sayed is only 30 years old and has already accomplished so much, including an appointment as assistant professor of epidemiology at Columbia University, over 100 published articles in prestigious medical journals, and an MD, PhD from Columbia University and the University of Oxford. And now, his role in Detroit. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, who is also a University of Michigan alumnus.
That was far too kind an introduction, but leave it to my fellow Wolverines to make it look good. So I'm honored to be here today. I was talking to Victor, who's a longtime friend of mine, and I'm normally used to being the youngest person in the room and the most energetic. So today I kind of feel like an elder statesman, which is kind of odd. But I'm honored to be here. I want to tell you, building on the stories that you've heard, I want to tell you a story of my family. When I started undergrad, I had one goal, and that goal was that I was going to be a surgeon in sub-Saharan Africa. I have failed, and my Egyptian parents remind me that every day. But those same Egyptian parents decided to come to Detroit back in 1978. Apparently my dad was between Detroit or this small industrial city called Bayreuth in Germany. So the only real similarity between those two is that they make cars and they end with the word Reut. So often try and imagine the German counterfactual of myself. But they chose to make a courageous jump to Detroit. My dad always tells the story that when he back in the day, when you wanted to buy a ticket, you couldn't just go on Orbitz and buy a ticket. You actually had to go to the airport and buy a ticket. It was a very formal thing. And so he finally waited in line and finally got to the counter. And he's like, I'd like 2 tickets to Detroit, please. The guy's like, son, you got to be mistaken. You don't want to go to Detroit. But he did. And I'm often, we have a complex relationship, I think, with parents. And for all of their challenges around why are you not a surgeon yet? I often thank them for being role models who took a chance and went to Detroit, which very much inspired me to come back. So I'm thankful to be there. And I want to tell you a little bit about why I failed as bad as I have, and maybe make an argument to you that my failure hasn't been so much a failure, but maybe a change in direction. I titled my talk today, Between the World and Me. Who's read the book? Fantastic book. If you haven't read it, you really ought to read it. But for three reasons, the title captures so much of how I've been thinking about health in a global context, and global between the world and me, who happens to be in Detroit, and also thinking about where we sit within global contexts. One thing I really appreciate about this generation is that it's one who's very much thinking actively about where we fit within global narratives in ways that I think our parents really did not. And so I'm trying to do the same. And part of the reason that I failed is because in college I met a professor in my senior year who happened to be and has become really a long-time mentor for me. And there, I'd already been accepted in medical school. I knew I wanted to be a surgeon in sub-Saharan Africa. I played lacrosse, but then quit my senior year, so I didn't really have anything to do. So I thought I was interested in public health. We met a bunch of people, and he's the only one who got back to me. And since then, I actually, up until last year, have worked with him, really 2007 through 2016, so 9 years. And he taught me a couple of things. And really frankly, he taught me about what public health is. So I want to start with that definition as we get into the talk. Public health is what we, as a society, do collectively to ensure the conditions for people to be healthy. And I want to highlight 3 aspects of this definition that I think really matter, and I hope set the stage in the ways that we think about the world and us. So the first is that public health is about context. It's about conditions. It's about situations, right? And those are the contexts, the situations, the conditions that allow some people to be healthy and other people not. The other is that public health is about people, not persons, but people, groups, collectives. It's about populations. And then lastly, public health is about being healthy rather than not being sick, which are 2 very different things. So public health is about health promotion rather than disease cure. So our goal then in public health is to promote health among people and places. And fundamentally, global health is about people in places. Okay? So I want to then use this definition to help us to think about 4 common conceptions about what global health ought to be. Okay? And these are the kinds of definitions that many of us come to as undergraduates when we're thinking about how it is that we want to make our dent in the world. And they come from really well-meaning narratives that we read and become really inspired by. But sometimes we have to question so that we can make our own narratives. The first is that the overwhelming injustice in global health is about the sheer burden of ill health in certain contexts. The second is that global health is about infectious diseases. The third is that the best way to combat global health is to deliver direct medical care to the underserved. And then finally, that global health starts abroad. All right? I think that you guys are pretty smart. You probably see where I'm going with this. But what I'm trying to do is help you to think through maybe some of the arguments that I've made to myself about maybe why I haven't really failed as bad as I thought I did. So let's start with the first. That the overwhelming injustice in global health stems from the sheer burden of ill health. All right? So if we take that as it is, we have to ask ourselves a question. What is justice? So go back to the literature. And there's one guy who really looms large, right? Does anybody know who this is? Rawls, okay? So, Rawls, the interesting thing about Rawls is that Rawls was about to lose his job before he dropped the mic, right? He actually he was at Harvard for a really long time before he published anything. In fact, some of them thought it was like he just stopped showing up to work. But But Rawls published really a treatise on what justice actually is. And then he defined justice as being two things. Okay, so I'll give you the technical definition and I'll try and tell you what it means to me, who's a very simple person. Each person is to have an equal right to the most basic extensive set of liberties, comparable to the liberties of others. Right? What that basically means is that the rules apply equally to everybody. Right? If you're going to have some rules, they should apply equally to everybody. Yeah? And the second is that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are A, reasonably expected to be in everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. So what does that mean? It basically means that the only time that we should accept inequality is if inequality is absolutely necessary for a particular end, right? So that if we are going to accept inequalities because we can't imagine a good that exists without that inequality. Some people would argue that the market has to have some sort of inequality to function. I don't know that I believe that. Rawls took it as a matter of premise. Okay? And the second is that if that is the case, that inequality should be equally distributed. There should not be classes of people that disproportionately suffer that inequality. Okay? And take it all together, to keep it real simple, justice is fairness. Okay? So let's reflect on that within the context of health. What you're seeing here is maternal mortality per 100,000 among racial groups in the United States relative to Tanzania. All right? So this is an extremely high maternal mortality rate. 900 out of every 100,000 women who give birth in Tanzania die in the course of childbirth. Okay? But that's not in and of itself unjust. What's unjust is that that's 900 times higher than it is in the United States. That's what injustice is. So take that sense of injustice as being a relative issue about fairness, and let's think about the proportionality of maternal mortality among racial groups in the United States. Okay? And what we see is that among African American mothers, the likelihood of dying during childbirth is about 4 times higher than it is among white mothers in the United States. Yeah? So we have intra-national disparities that are unjust as well. Okay? So the burden of disease, although it is astounding, is not in and of itself unjust. A number cannot be unjust. A number relative to another number can be unjust. Okay? So systematic inequalities by country, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, sexuality, that is fundamentally unjust. And addressing inequalities then has to be the primary impetus for a justice-based global health movement. Yes? So we go from the overwhelming injustice in global health has to do with the burden of disease in a particular place to potentially a more nuanced argument, which is that the overwhelming injustice in global health stems from a systematically unequal burden of disease across various classes. So let's go to the second one. Global health is about infectious diseases. Now, I want to just look at the numbers. I'm an epidemiologist. Where's my friend who is a numbers person? So, global health being about infectious diseases. What you're seeing here is what's called the Preston curve. This is an old version of the Preston curve, but the curve really hasn't changed with time. Yeah? And what you see is that in the first $10,000 of GDP per capita in a particular society, the likelihood or the life expectancy in that particular country goes up substantially. And then after that, you get a bit of a flat. So what I want to do is dig that apart a little bit, right? Why is that the case? So let's ask ourselves, how do diseases change with economic development? So let's think about the first bit of the curve here. What kind of diseases are people dying of in countries with less than $10,000 GDP per capita? Infectious diseases, right? Why is that the case? Why do you see this huge increase in life expectancy over the course of the first $10,000? So you said they die of infectious diseases, but what's happening in that context that's solving the problem with the first $10,000 of GDP? Let's see a hand. Yes, sir.
Diet, sanitation, clean water.
Okay, so you said sanitation and clean water. Those are actually the same thing, right? There's like a fundamental challenge that humanity has faced for most of our history, which is, simply put, how do you separate the water you drink from the water you do other stuff with? Right? Right? No, I'm serious. That is like a fundamental question, and when we solved that, it changed pretty quick. You see it right here on the curve.
right? And so what happens is that that first $10,000 of GDP per capita, society can buy itself sanitation systems. What's the other thing that happens? So I want you to ask yourself, when you say infectious diseases, what are the two main kinds of infectious diseases we're talking about, right? You just talked about cholera, basically, right? And other diarrheal disease. What's the other way people die of infectious disease largely? What other organ gets infected that kills you? Huh? The lungs, right? So how do you stop infectious disease transmission for upper respiratory infection? Huh? I heard it. Crowding, right? So literally you have too many people living on top of each other and breathing the same air, right? So one of them gets tuberculosis, now all of them have tuberculosis. One of them gets pneumonia, all of them have pneumonia, yeah? So those two differences, crowding and the capacity to separate water that you drink from other kinds of water, that's the infectious disease challenge right there, in a nutshell, right? So let's look at what happens here. So if we were to say all deaths in 1 year, we represent them as 1,000 deaths overall, okay? 163 of them would happen in low-income countries. And of those 163, the plurality of them would be lower respiratory infections, then diarrheal diseases, then HIV/AIDS, then heart disease, and then a bunch of potentially, I don't want to say marginal, but diseases that don't kill as many people, okay? So then what happens up here? What are the diseases that folks suffer from after they've solved those two fundamental challenges? These are chronic diseases, yeah? So if we looked at the burden of chronic diseases, they would account for about 84% of the deaths, yeah? And most of them would be in middle-income countries. And the majority, or the plurality of those, would be ischemic heart disease. And then after that, stroke and cerebrovascular disease, which is the same pathology, just happening in a different organ, right? And then COPD, which is largely attributable to smoking, right? And then if you look, 159 of them would be in high-income countries like the United States. Again, heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, which is also attributable to smoking, right? And then a number of others, okay? So as we move up, we see that the kinds of diseases that folks suffer change substantially, right? Because of the capacity for society to solve a fundamental set of challenges, which is around water and around crowding, okay? So does the pattern hold within a country? Well, what is the, in theory, most developed country in the world? America. So let's look at what happened in America, right, between 1900 and 2000 in terms of infectious disease deaths, yeah? And there are a couple of things I just want you to identify here, right? Oftentimes, you guys are a thoughtful crowd, but when I share this number with most people, or I ask them what happened in the United States to drop the infectious disease mortality, what are the answers you think I get? Vaccines and antibiotics, right? But I just want you to look at this. Where is the first use of an antibiotic? 1940. Infectious disease mortality had already dropped to 25% of its 1900 rate before we ever had antibiotics. Okay? And then where's the first use of vaccine? Right here. Yeah? So we had been dropping infectious disease mortality substantially before these things were ever discovered and or used. Yeah? Now, for somebody who spends a lot of time making sure people get vaccines, it's not to say vaccines are bad, no, vaccines are very good. Yes? However, it is to say that the main story here is about how we as a society, right, were able to build situations within which, contexts within which, people were not drinking water that had been, and were not breathing the same air as everybody else was already sick. Once you deal with those things, vaccines are great, and antibiotics lovely, right? I'm just saying that we have to put them in context. So does the trend generalize? Well, let's look at the most common causes of disease between 2004 and projected into 2030. Let's look at the ones that are going up, yeah? The ones that are going up are depressive disorder. They are ischemic heart disease. They are cerebrovascular disease, which is stroke. They are diabetes mellitus. And then the ones that are going down are lower respiratory infections. They are diarrheal diseases. They are HIV/AIDS. Okay? So the trend certainly generalizes globally. So where we have this conception that global health is about infectious diseases, rather, in fact, global health is about chronic disease. Okay? And then the third point is, well, we believe often that the best way to combat the global burden of disease is to provide direct medical care to the underserved. When I was an undergrad, one of the big inspirations in my life was having read Paul Farmer, right? Now, I don't mean to say anything about it. I mean, like, I think I'll probably get sacked if I say anything bad about him. Paul Farmer is a fantastic man. He's done amazing work. However, right, a lot of what Paul Farmer has argued is implied here, that in fact, you have to provide the same medical care across the globe. And that may in fact be an equity issue. But I just showed you the numbers about medical care. I just showed you what actually solved the huge infectious disease burden that we had in our country, right? It had very little to do with medical care and a lot more to do with infrastructure. So let's examine this a little bit more. Now, you might say there's a lot of disease. You got to do something about it. Well, I'm just going to share with you the waterfall story. Who's heard the waterfall story? This girl on her phone just like I've heard before. I've got it, thanks. I'll tell you the waterfall story. So you're walking, and let's say that you're in Guatemala, and you happen to hear, you're walking super hot, you're in the middle of a rainforest in Guatemala because you and your friends decided it'd be really cool to go on a hike, right? And you start to hear water, and you're like, my God, there might be a waterfall somewhere in the distance. So you start moving towards that sound. And then all of a sudden, the sound of the waterfall starts to get sullied by the sound of people screaming. This is a really dystopic story. And so you walk and you keep going, and all of a sudden you start seeing people falling down the waterfall, right? So what do? You jump in and try and save them. All of you except for one, right? The one who was on her phone, she's like, yes, I heard the story. You run to the top of the waterfall, and you figure out why people are falling in the first place, yes? So these are two approaches to thinking about disease. Do you deal with illness, or do you think upstream, literally upstream, and think about why people are becoming ill in the first place? So, one might argue then, you still need doctors for prevention, right? Doctors prevent disease. So I want to contrast the way that doctors prevent disease versus the way that public health professionals think about prevention, all right? So, the entire population is a completely undiverse group of blue, androgynous, two-dimensional humans. Yes? There are 176 of them. Okay? And imagine that some of these people are high risk. It doesn't really matter for what, they're just high risk for some disease. Okay? Now, if we were to move this population forward, we just project them forward in time, obviously some of them would get the disease. What I want you to appreciate here, though, is that although being high risk by definition means that your likelihood of getting disease is higher, right? It doesn't mean that if you're high risk, you are the only one who gets disease. So another way of saying that is, people who aren't high risk also get disease. Yes? So how does medicine deal with prevention? Well, imagine that same group was all distributed on a distribution of the particular risk factor we're talking about. Yeah? How would we decide what high risk meant? We would draw some arbitrary line. Arbitrary line being this one here. And we'd say that everybody to the right of the line is high risk. Everybody to the left of the line is not. So what is that line for high blood pressure, for hypertension? What is that line? Who knows? It is 1/3, right? So, if you're walking around at 132, you are hypertensive. If you are walking around at 128, you're fine, right? So, what do we do to those folks? Well, we have this fantastic clinical encounter. Anybody here in med school? Right? Anybody here in med school? Wow. We have one person. So, this is exactly how we do it. Anybody here a physician? No? Tough crowd. All right, we got a couple. So, this is entirely how they teach. Look at his eye contact. Right? And he's perfectly starched white coat, although he's probably got bacteria all over it. And he's even walking through the entire, he's like showing her labs. Like, this doesn't happen, but this is a conscientious doc. So he is telling her, ma'am, I'm worried that you are hypertensive. I believe that we may start you on a diuretic, and we are going to make you hypertensive. So he does, and you truncate the entire risk distribution and put everybody else, right, into the rest of the curve. What's the problem with this? There's a whole ton of unaddressed underlying risk, right? these folks still have risk of disease, and we haven't done anything for them. Because you walked in at 128, you're like, hey, okay, fantastic, right? But if you were 131, seriously, we'd have to start going somewhere. So, while the medical strategy might see this, all the folks who are high risk to begin with, it misses all of these people. So I want to contrast that with how we think about prevention in public health. In public health, our goal is not to actually say we're high risk, low risk as individuals. Our goal is just simply to shift the entire risk distribution. So we go from this to this, and ultimately this. Okay? Then the question becomes, how do we shift the curve? How do you do that? Well, if you subscribe to the belief in social determinants of health, you have to start thinking upstream. You have to be thinking about all of the policies and institutions and neighborhoods and communities and conditions and relationships that ultimately shape risk factors and ultimately shape population. Okay? And just to put an exclamation point on that, if you don't believe that social well-being influences health, just look at the curve, right? It matters a lot. So the best way to combat the global burden of disease is to target and shift the population determinants of disease. So the final contention, that global health has to start at home. But I want to review this first, okay? We started with the contention that the overwhelming injustice of global health stems from a sheer burden of ill health in certain places. And we ended with the argument that actually the overwhelming injustice had to do with systematically unequal health in different contexts or in different groups. We started with the contention that global health is about infectious diseases. And we agree now that global health is actually about chronic disease. We started with the argument that the best way to combat global burdens of disease is to provide direct medical care. And we've ended with the argument that, in fact, the best way to do so is to target and shift the population determinants of disease. So now we have three truths. I want to hold up the fourth contention to these three truths. So if global health starts abroad, well, actually the problem with this is that inequalities in health occur locally as well. And Chris Murray, who actually is the PI of the Global Burden of Disease study at University of Washington, sort of took this global health lens and just turned it inward in the United States. And he articulated that there were, in fact, 8 different Americas based on who you were and where you lived. Okay? And I just want to show you the difference in life expectancy across different counties in the United States. There is a deep inequality in health in the United States. So we have to ask ourselves then, well, there is inequality globally, and then there's inequality in the United States. Are they the same, or are they different? And if they're not the same, then which of them matters more? Which is the one we should be focusing on? So I want to introduce 2 terms here. Consonance being agreement or compatibility, and then dissonance being super dissonant. Dissonance being a tension or a clash, resulting from the combination of 2 disharmonious or unsuitable elements. And what I want to ask you is about consonance or dissonance between people and places, which is where we started. Okay? Just to illustrate the point, a couple of years ago, a guilty pleasure of mine, whose music I don't quite like, but for some reason I just deeply appreciate her general persona in life, came under some heat. Yeah? And that was my friend Miley. So Miley decided at the VMAs a couple years ago that she was going to do that, right? And that was she took some heat for that, right? But the question is she contextually consonant? Well, it's a music video award show. She is a musician, and she's dancing with another musician. Contextually consonant? Probably. But far more contextually consonant than Miley dancing in a classical painting. Right? So if Miley decided to jump into classical painting, I'd be like, Miley, that's not right. Okay? So our job is to promote health among people and places. Okay? So we have to ask ourselves about contextual consonance versus contextual dissonance. And I want to make a very serious argument here. So these 2 boys live in Soweto, yeah, in South Africa. Now, South Africa is a deeply unequal country, deeply unequal. But I want to ask you if these boys are consonant to their context. All of the other people who live in their village live a very similar life to the one that they live, okay? And I want to contrast that with this gentleman here, right? This gentleman, this picture made some headlines a couple of years ago because it was during the New York Fashion Week. This happens to be the post office right by Madison Square Garden. And these fashionistas here decided that they were going to objectify this man, drawing a contrast between themselves and their opulence and his poverty, right? So this gentleman here is far richer in real assets than those boys. Far richer, right? When he gets a quarter or a couple of dollars, those dollars are actually of far greater absolute value than what those boys likely live on in a day, right? But you would agree that he's very contextually distant, yes? New York is the richest city in the richest country in the world. And yet, his experience probably doesn't reflect that. So, let's bring us back to the question. Is all inequality the same? Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett have looked at inequality in health, right? And their question is about whether or not inequality, independent of the people who suffer inequality, whether or not inequality unto itself has health consequences. And what they showed, you can basically identify here. So what you're seeing here is the median share of income. So what proportion of the population accounts for 51% of all the money, right? Relative to age-adjusted death rates. And each of these bubbles represents a city in one of these 5 countries. You with me? And what you see here is that the age-adjusted death rates in the most unequal cities, the ones where the smallest proportion of the population account for the greatest proportion of wealth, their age-adjusted death rates overall were higher than in more equal cities. I also want you to look at the clustering by country, right? So you see a clustering effect with the colors by country. And so you're getting the double effect here, the effect of the city itself, as well as the effect of the country within which the city sits. So inequality here is associated with worse health. And they argue that it's because people's health is related to their social and economic circumstances, partly through their subjective responses to them. So it's a fact that if you live in a wealthy society but you're poor, your understanding of your poverty is put in front of your face every day. Not only that though, if you're rich in an unequal society, you now have an incentive to protect yours because you know that those folks, there's poverty there. And so the stress that's borne on both of those groups is substantially higher than if you live in an equitable context. So contextually dissonant inequality may be worse than contextually constant inequality. The second point is this, right? We know that with development overall in a particular country, not to say that the rising tide lifts all boats, not at all, but it is to say that there is a possibility, right, that as a country develops, the health outcomes in that country will stabilize across the board, right? And the point is to say that that gentleman in New York is not going to be, his health status is not going to be improved because New York developed. Whereas those boys have a shot, right? So the second point about this is to say that contextually dissonant inequality is less likely to improve with development. So let's think about just in the context of this first truth. Now let's look at the second truth. Global health is about chronic diseases. Well, the challenge of chronic diseases remains deeply unsolved in high-income countries. So just to share with you a couple of things, you'll note here that in both middle and high-income countries, the overwhelming burden of disease and death had to do with chronic diseases, not even close to being solved. And I just want you to look at this findings from this paper here. What they looked at was the growth in obesity across various regions between 1980 and 2008. And what you'll know is that these here represent lower income contexts or middle income contexts, whereas the greatest disparity were in high income countries, for the most part, right? The greatest growth in obesity happened in high income contexts. That's not to say that we don't have a growing obesity epidemic globally. That is to say that the worst of it happened in high and middle income countries. And here you're seeing, just in effect, a linear growth in chronic disease in the United States, which continues today. fact, that growth has been so intense and so unperturbed that this paper here suggested that it may in fact lead to the first decline in life expectancy in US history in the last 100 years. You guys know what happened 100 years ago that caused a decline in life expectancy? Hand? Anyone? War was part of it, but there's actually a huge pandemic in 1918. Flu pandemic, right? The flu pandemic actually caused the first decline in life expectancy, or the last decline in life expectancy. So I just want to show you a very striking figure here. And what you're seeing here is expected life expectancy as predicted in various years. So in 1981, people were pretty excited about what was going to happen, right? So this is life expectancy when people were already 65, right? So we're abstracting away young folks. So if you're already 65, in 1981, right, they had expected that by 2020, because we're almost there, you would expect to be, average life expectancy for somebody who's 65 would have been to the age of, do the math, 21 plus 65, 86, yeah? And then the reality of obesity started to happen, and people were like, okay, maybe we're being a little bit excited, right? So in 1984, they're like, yeah. That was also the year I was born, so they were like, yeah, this guy's gonna bring it down. So 84 they revised, and then 95 they revised again, yeah, and then 2003 they revised yet again. All of these revisions occurred because people started to appreciate the fact that obesity and diabetes were going to change the game, right? We hadn't really planned on it. Another point is to say this. Just last year, when we looked at life expectancy numbers, we found that there was in fact a decline in middle-aged men in the United States, middle-aged white men in the United States specifically, right? And in a lot of ways, if you think about that group, which is in effect the most privileged group in the United States, they are the canary in the coal mine for what's coming next. So it tells you a lot about the fact that we have not dealt with these challenges yet. Not only that, it's really, really expensive. So you see here a spaghetti blot of various countries and national health spending in a proportion of GDP, right? And America is #1, going strong. And we have not really, we haven't really bent this curve yet. So we spent 18 cents on the dollar on healthcare in the United States because we haven't solved the problem. So the chronic disease epidemic is really the most challenging question for global health's future. 84% of people are most likely to die of a chronic disease in the world. We don't have effective clinical or policy solutions. And helping us to develop them, right? Those solutions that we think about here and now are going to be the solutions that at least set the stage for what comes next. So local becomes global, okay? So us solving our problems here has implications for how others solve their problems there, wherever there is. And then lastly, the argument that the best way to combat global burden of disease is targeting and shifting population determinants. So I just want to ask you a simple question, right? Where do you have the most influence? In the society in which you were born and raised and understand, or in a different society? Very simple question. The irony of this is to say that my parents immigrated from Egypt, right, in 1978 and came to the United States for all of the things that immigrants hope for in their lives, right? And it's ironic because I had thought, well, I need to go elsewhere and make a difference. And the interesting thing is that I would go, so I went to high school in the suburbs just outside of Detroit, and I could go 10 miles south or 3,000 miles east and see the same kind of poverty in Detroit that I would see in Alexandria in my family's village, right? So global health starts abroad? No, global health has to start at home, okay? So now I want to tell you a little bit about Detroit. Detroit has been a place that I've recently come home to, and I spent a long time learning population health. learning about the social determinants, learning about various kinds of skills that I could use to address issues of poverty as they relate to health. And then I would see headlines, right? As a Detroiter outside of Detroit, I'd see headlines. And headlines that looked kind of like this. Detroit's infant mortality rate is worse than Mexico's, right? And I had to ask myself, well, what are you doing in an ivory tower in New York when in the city that you call home, people suffer the very kinds of diseases that you've built a skill set to try and address, okay? And what's interesting about this map here of Detroit is, in fact, what it does is it goes by zip code, and it compares the infant mortality rate in that zip code to a various other country. And remember what I told you about Egypt? Well, in 48206, the infant mortality rate is, in fact, very similar to that of Egypt. Right? The other thing I want you to take from this is that we often think about challenges in a city as being homogenous in that city. But problems are hyper-local. Working in a place like Detroit, which has these headlines about how bad things are, you come to realize that, in fact, it's not all of Detroit. Right? I live here, and then I drive to work here. And these two are very different neighborhoods. And then in the course of the day, I might go visit a clinic here, or go visit a clinic here, or go visit a community group here, or some community members over here, and they all look different. Problems are hyper-local. And I think sometimes we look at our own backyard and we say, well, that's the place I know. I know what that looks like. It's so much more adventurous to be elsewhere. Right? But our backyard, and the next guy's backyard, and the next girl's backyard, those are very different places sometimes. And we owe it, I think, to those spaces to give them the dignity of appreciating how different they might be and how important they might be, even though we may know them and we've grown up around them forever. I'd also see headlines like this, the fittest and fattest cities in America. And what you see here is obesity by census tract mapped onto corner stores. Now, who's ever heard of food deserts? Yeah? Have you heard of food swamps?
Yeah.
So the reality is that you can get food wherever you want in Detroit. It's just not the kind of food that you want, right? It's not the kind of food that's healthy. So what you see here is corner stores, right? Corner stores, liquor stores, bodegas, whatever you want to call them, right? And what's interesting about obesity in Detroit is the main output, the main sales product for these kinds of corner stores is alcohol, right? But they also want to be able to take food stamps, right? EBT, WIC, they want to be able to take those. So they do stock some food. So what happens is alcohol subsidizes a particular kind of food that's sold ubiquitously in Detroit. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about the food challenge in a second, but I just want you to think about that for a second, right? What is the economics of getting people healthy foods? And then finally, Detroit's staggering murder and violent crime rate are a public health issue. What you see here is homicide by zip code. Now, my very well-meaning mother will call me sometimes and she'll say, "Honey, are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, Mom, I'm fine. Why would I not be okay?" "Honey, Detroit's dangerous." I'm like, "Mom, what we don't appreciate about problems like this is that the same groups who are likely to suffer violence are the same groups that are likely to perpetrate violence. It's a very localized epidemic, right? And we have to think about it that way. And what you see is that I live in 48226, a very different kind of homicide rate than maybe 48228, right? And so we have here a set of gangs that live and occupy this space, and that's the reason that we have the kind of homicide rate that we have, right? And the reality is that the groups who are likely to suffer this, young black men, are the most likely to perpetrate it, are the most likely to suffer the long-term consequences of it through jail, through not being able to find housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a much deeper pathology than simply, it's a dangerous place. What's also been interesting being back in Detroit from the Detroit side is the way that the story is told by the media, who normally tells the story between Detroit and the suburbs of Detroit about how dangerous Detroit is or should be. So I want to give you just some context about Detroit. Why is it that we suffer the kinds of consequences, health consequences in Detroit? Detroit is very poor. So what you're seeing here is median income by census tract. Detroit is one of the poorest, it is the poorest large city in America, right? And what you're seeing is, even in the high zone, you're talking about $18,000 to $45,000. We have an unemployment rate of about 24%. Right? 1 in 4 people doesn't have a job. Detroit is very poor. And it also suffers the health consequences of that. So the biggest increase in healthcare coverage in Detroit after Obamacare was entirely about Medicaid expansion. Okay? And so more than 50% of Detroiters are covered on Medicaid, which is intended to be a safety net healthcare program. So that's not it though, right? We have poverty. Poverty is really important. Lack of access to healthcare is really important. But there are structural realities in Detroit that make it what it is in terms of the superlative health outcomes that we face. The first is vacancy, right? So between 2000 and 2010, Detroit's population shrank substantially, right? And that's 2000 and 2010, not 1968, since which the population has declined substantially before that, right? So this is just the last decade. The other point is that Detroit's gigantic. You could fit all of San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan in the city of Detroit and still have room left over. So now you have people who are poor. They don't live around other people because it's so vacant, right? So when vacancy happens, it's not like a whole block just up and leaves. It's that all of a sudden, within 30 years, you look right, look left, and nobody's there anymore. And then lastly, what you're seeing here is the tragic irony of the Motor City. So this is Wayne County, the county that houses Detroit, and then Detroit. And what you're seeing is car ownership. And you see that in Detroit, very little car ownership. Yet we are the Motor City, right? 20% of Detroiters have regular access to a car. 20% can say, I'm going to go jump in my car and get to where they need to go. So I want you to think about this. Poor people in a huge city where very few other people live, right? And they can't get around. Now ask yourself, if you're a grocery store, do you want to open up in Detroit? What do you need if you are a grocery store? You need paying customers who can get to your store. That doesn't always happen, right? So when we think about the challenges that we face, we have to think about consequence and context of teaching, because it's about people and places. And lastly, Detroit went bankrupt in 2012. So I'm just showing you, relative to 2 other relatively poor American cities, right, how much the city invests in public health. So relative to Baltimore's $41 per person per year, we spend $1.50, right? And that's what poor governance does. So it's not simply poverty. Poverty is the challenge. But sometimes we get defeated by saying, oh, it's poverty, how are you going to solve poverty? But you can think innovatively about structural challenges. And that's what we're trying to do in Detroit. So with that, I just want to leave you with, this is a picture I have getting actually framed and put up in my office. And this is a picture of Detroit in the 1950s, right? And I just want you to think about the irony of this, yeah? Who has and who doesn't? Who suffers the kinds of challenges that we looked at, right? And why? How are decisions made throughout history in Detroit? How do they now implant themselves in the health and well-being of a population like ours, right? And then how do you deal with that? Because at the end of the day, local is global. Dealing with challenges like this shape the way that post-industrial contexts will think about health for a long time to come. And we cannot ignore the challenges in our own backyard, right? They are folks who live in Detroit, who I see every day, who I work with, who I advocate for, right? These are folks who have been passed over and over and over again. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, as we are young folks who are dedicating our lives to causes that matter, how dedicated are we to the people who suffer the marginalization in our own country, right? And abroad, because local becomes global. With that, Detroit heals harder. Thank you so much. I have time for one question. So, who wants to be the one? A lot of pressure. One question. So I got no questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Amira. I'm a student at Washington University, Untitled Chapter. I have a question to you in relation to your context. You mentioned Egypt and your parents immigrating, how that's created part of your identity as academic. This is a bit of a narrow but what kind of advice do you have to first-generation immigrants and children of first-generation immigrants in terms of being ownership of our communities and feeling like this is home and defining this is home, and then using that kind of energy and momentum to make change here? And sometimes you feel like there's a lot of sort of backup. What kind of advice do you give?
That's not a narrow question. And the reason I think it's an extremely broad question is because it cuts to the point of what is America, right? It's almost impossible to ignore the context of the discourse that we hear every day about what is and is not American, therefore who is and who is not American. I normally answer, I get a lot of questions about, A, why are you in Detroit? B, what are you? And C, explain to me why you really do care about America, right? Or about Detroit. And normally my answer to that question comes in three parts. The first is that I carry dual citizenship, right? And I grew up spending most of my summers in another country where I understood what it meant not to have the right to self-govern, right? So when I was a little kid, I remember going down, and as little kids do, my grandparents, I was just there with my grandparents, and they were like, you can't say anything about the president. So the next time we were out, I started cussing out the president at the top of the lungs in the middle of the market. And a couple of hours later, the Plain Post cops came to the door and knocked on our door. So when I started in Detroit, I had the unfortunate responsibility of taking over the animal control shelter, which was in terrible shape. And we got protested almost every day. And most days I would go to the protesters, and normally the same people, like, is there anything that you want to tell me today, right? And they were like, why are you so embracing of the protesters? And my point was that, look, I know what it's like to live in a country where you can't actually do this. And I know how important this is to what it means to be American. And this is a beautiful thing. This is the essence of self-government. And the other point is to say that my parents came here willingly. They chose to be American. Right? I remember being 8 years old, and my stepmom is white American. And I remember her telling me that, today Bubba is American. And I was like, no, he's not. You're American. Bubba's not American. And like, no, America is a concept that is bigger than what you look like or how you sound when you talk, right? America is about all of us coming together around an ideal of what we can be as a nation. That's what America is. And at that point, I had a lot of questions about whether or not I was American, this whole thing. But I've firmly come to believe that I am. And now the question about Detroit, the final point is to say that who we are is actually hyper-local, right? As an Arab American, the question of where I was from, that was a hard question. But I could tell you that I rooted for the Red Wings, and I rooted for the Tigers, and I rooted for the Lions, and I was the biggest Michigan fan alive when I was from Detroit, right? So the sense of place, the people that you see, the context, the fabric of the places that you engage in, those become who you are. And so I would say that we decide that we are American the day we decide to commit to the ideals of this country. And folks who would say otherwise are all the reason more to keep committing to it.